Is my audio okay? Sorry, because I always get comments about my... No, that's fine. Perfect.
And then my mic's up. All right, everybody, welcome. Why don't you just in the chat see how the audio is? We welcome our guest, Dr. Joshua Sijuwade, if I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Um, how's our audio comparing our audios? I think I fixed it from the last interview that I have that the person I was interviewing was much louder. So why don't you just let me know how that sounds? Everybody loves you. We're so happy to have you here.
No,
And
thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really
and
happy to be here.
yeah, I just want to give for the audience a little background. As you know, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, um, a really hot topic came up, particularly because of the new pope, who's really confirming what the last pope and Vatican II said about whether, on the question, Muslims and Christians worship the same God. And I feel like about 2 months ago, this was kind of kicked back up and it became a hot topic. And as you know, I had been working with Dr. Gareby and his paper, Theistic Fallacies, um, that basically argued in a different way than you did, which I really appreciate that your paper, um, but that we in fact don't. Dr. Gareby was a student of Richard Swinburne, and obviously a lot of that, as far as kind of theories of reference, Richard Swinburne had something known as the, I always want to say common core, but it's called the core doctrine.
Yeah.
Um, and that this allowed us to fix a referent and then say, of course, well, Muslims and Christians do worship. They're just, Muslims are really wrong. And if you remember, uh, Dr. Trent Dortry and Dr. Christopher Tomaszewski uh, were brought on. We had kind of a debate about that. And so then you came out with this wonderful paper. And one of the things I really like about it is it's different than what Dr. Gareby and I were arguing. And I think that um, I like the way that you take it. Because it seemed that, and I still think the argument that Dr. Gareby and I were making was a good argument, um, but it seemed to leave my opponents. They wanted to kind of see the details of how this worked, and so in your paper, you developed something called serious essentialism. I think that's great. I think that gets into the nitty gritty philosophically in terms of philosophy of language, that it's exactly the kind of nuts and bolts that our opponents want to see. So, everybody, welcome Dr. Sijuwade, and we'll talk about your paper. And also, I think it's a great apologetic for orthodoxy too. People probably wonder, like, what's the differences and why do how does Orthodox theology work? How does ecclesiology? And a lot of these things were kind of brought up through these debates. And it was really nice that you kind of ended your paper with kind of going in and fleshing that out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Let's see. Why don't, for the audience sake, and I know we'll try to, I warn people, I'm like, forgive, it's philosophy of language is one of the most difficult areas of philosophy too. And, I knew when I debated Dr. Trent Dortry and Christopher Thomas Rescue that I'm like, this is going to go over everybody's head. It's really
Yeah, I understand the feeling.
So forgive us that, we'll try to make it not too technical. But as I always say, one thing that's really interesting is, tell me what you think about this before we start this off. I was talking to my students yesterday, and I said, I start off in intuition, and I think there's something to be said about that. There's something, even philosophically, when somebody presents me an argument or I'm thinking about my own argument, it always kind of starts in my right brain with an intuitive, like, something's off and wrong about this, or I just know that this is right and the other thing's wrong. And then I kind of go into the kind of left brain and very analytic, and it's like checking your work in mathematics. Like, I go through all the logic and stuff like that. I'm like, okay, I was right.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that I think I'm right about this.
Yeah.
And people get, I want to say this as kind of a disclaimer. People see our arguments and they're very complicated. It's very difficult, and they think, well, is this what I have to go through to know that Christians and Muslims don't worship the same God? I would argue no. Like, lean into your heart. Everybody I talk to, the common folk are like, if you said that, they would know. Of course we don't. As I said, that the problem is philosophers, my philosophical opponents. I think a lot of these things are really easy. They make it really difficult, more difficult than it needs to be. And then what do we have to do? It's like, well, now I've got to go in and answer the philosopher. But I think there's something intuitively in the heart that everybody knows. So, disclaimer: no, you don't have to go through all of this philosophy to know that Christians and Muslims don't worship the same God. However, this is a type of object that we are answering the philosophical objection.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so just off of that, if I can just say, so there's what I would always say to people, that there is different levels of clarity that people need to have, and it depends what your goal is. So, for example, if I'm teaching my daughters, I've got 3 daughters, and I'm teaching them, about something in Christianity, about the Trinity. I'm not going to start going into terms maybe about the homoousios and, saying, how does that make sense, and how can there be one God, and all these sort of things. It'll be the level of saying, the Son and the Father are equal, and they'll understand what that means. But then if they want further clarity, that's when we're going to go deeper into it and say, well, when they get a little bit older and they have more mental maturity, then we can then say, actually, you know what, you have these questions now. Let's go a little bit deeper to try and make sense of this. But you need to meet the person where they're at. So, for example, you see the same thing with science. When you are in high school in America, and in secondary school which is called in Britain, I doubt your teacher's going to start bringing out, textbooks about the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. They're not going to be doing that, even though that's a central area of study in science. But what they'll do is that they'll meet you where you are at. So for someone who has a question, do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? As long as you trust the testimony of the person that's speaking to you and they're reliable, it's sufficient enough to go with the answer of no, they don't. But then if you want to have questions to deal with certain objections because you've heard other people raise them, then you can go a little bit deeper into it. That's the sort of approach I'll go with this.
And I like this too. I've been noticing, I'm teaching an epistemology course this semester. I taught one last semester, and it is such a blessing to be a teacher because your students teach you. I'm learning through kind of questions that they ask and they approach. And I like what you said, sufficient. One of the things that I realize is that, unbeknownst to most people, I think they're Cartesians. They have this weird, like, well, it's not knowledge unless I have an indubitable justification to
Yeah,
eliminate every possibility. And I'm like,
yeah,
that's weird
yes,
because
yeah,
we would probably not know anything if that
yeah,
is the case. So think about this, especially when we're talking about where people are at. Most people, and I would say even most philosophers and epistemologists, don't have that strict of criteria for justification that it's like, I have to eliminate every possible doubt and possible.
yeah,
Do we have good enough reasons?
yeah,
Justifications. That's a
yeah,
sufficient. And that makes
yeah,
sense in terms of talking to people where they're at.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that is true. Because I think, yeah, we have, and also it depends as well what the context of what we're looking at. Because when it comes to certain issues, people are like, oh, we need to have certainty, 100% certainty for, for this to count as us knowing something. But in other areas, we don't have, we have a looser sort of a looser standard or a weaker standard for this. So yeah, it's about being consistent and also knowing, yeah, in philosophy, generally you wouldn't be having that higher standard just to claim knowledge for a certain proposition.
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I bring it up all the time. I'm like, I always use my local
Mm.
all right, I'm going to convert into your language. My local petrol station,
Yeah. That's
um,
good.
that I think I'm justified in knowing it's actually a gas station, petrol station,
Mhm. Mhm.
even though I can't eliminate the possibility. Well, how do I know it's not a facade and that's, they're
Yes.
actually
Yeah.
not selling gas in there and that it
Yeah.
doesn't disappear when it's like, come on. I mean, we'd
Yeah.
be locked up in a loony bin if we applied that
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
standard across the
Exactly. Yeah. It's
board.
just impractical.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. Well, let's dig into your paper.
Yeah.
Um, and why don't we, let's see, I'm trying to think how we should start with this.
Mhm.
Let's just for the audience, real quick, let's just define sense and reference.
Yeah.
This goes back to obviously Frege. Um, and our opponents are going to be obviously using these examples of phosphorus and phosphorus and, H2O and water and stuff like that. So that becomes just in terms, something important for our audience to define.
Yeah. So it's very interesting because yeah, that's what you'll sort of see with the for sort of coming from a Christian standpoint, maybe with something like Roman Catholicism or other forms of Christianity, when they sort of put forward the position that Christians and Muslims do worship the same God, they will sort of start from that standpoint of this fragrant sort of distinction between sense and reference. So if we understand reference is where you're using a word and the word points towards something. So if you have an object and I'm using a word, so for example, names are referring terms. So if I say David is picking out a specific object, a person that goes by that name. But then the idea that we have here is sense is a different thing. Sense is about the way in which the object is presented or conceived. So the presentation, which will be also the way we describe it, might have a different sense. So, for example, um, let me actually use the religious examples, so we don't spend too much time going with the analogy. But with with the sort of religious example, someone who defends the proposition that Muslims and Christians worship the same God, what they would say with this distinction of sense and reference is saying that Muslims and Christians refer to the same God. That means that their term, God, is picking out the same object. It's not picking out two different objects, it's picking out one. And however, the sense that they operate under is different. So the way in which the Muslim understands or conceives of God is as Allah, as through Tawhid and through the Islamic scriptures. But the way that Christians conceive of God would be as the Father of Jesus Christ, and so the one who eternally generates the Son and the Spirit. So the idea here is that there is different senses, the way in which we conceive of God for Muslims and for Christians, but we're ultimately referring to the same thing. So that's normally how they will try and bring that a way to make sense of, well, how could we be worshipping the same God if we have different ideas of God? Well, they'll say, yes, we have different senses about God. The way in which we conceive of God within Islam or within Christianity are different. But ultimately, the word God that we're using when we use it in worship is picking out one being only, the being who is God. And so that's sort of how they sort of marry those two positions together, and also using the sense reference distinction.
Yeah. Okay. What is he saying? Oh, that's good. Okay. It's so what they want to, let's say the reason why we're writing this stuff is because people are objecting.
Yeah.
And so we can give some examples, and they're going to use these as analogies that, well, you could have radically different senses in which something's conceived, and yet still fix on the same referent. And that would be, I mean, the Frege's example is if you described the morning star and the evening star, they're very different.
Yeah.
Yet and this is going to become important too, because in your paper you talk about the difference between essential feature or property contradicting versus being ignorant. Now, the case with the Hesperus and Phosphorus, the evening and morning star, is we're ignorant, even though we have these radically different ways of kind of conceiving, i.e. the sense. We're ignorant, in fact, of certain information. In fact, it's Venus. It's the same. And the same with water, too. We find out later that water is H2O. And then for some reason, they love Superman and Clark Kent examples.
Yeah.
And, well, see, we could, be radically different in thinking, we're referring to the same thing. And if that's possible, then obviously you could have these radically different conceptions between how the Muslim views God and the Christian, as you pointed out, but we're still referring to the same entity.
Yes.
We're still fixing our referent. And so it's not, I think that Dr. Trent Dortry and Christopher Tomasłowski kind of strawman and misunderstood what the argument is. It wasn't simply because I have empirical examples. I think this one in my paper, that the Promised Land. Okay. And then you're like, oh, wow, yeah, I've been to the Promised Land. Oh, yeah, that's where I found Jesus. I was saved. In fact, I get all my theology from the Promised Land, and I hope to go back to the Promised Land one day. And then you find out later that one's talking about the local Christian bookstore, and the other one is the geographical location. The argument isn't because empirically we can, make mistakes, therefore it could happen with God. We're saying something different. So all their arguments were kind of based on that. So what's really nice, Dr. Garvey and I argued that, and it was different from your argument. I appreciate your argument. We're going to get into it in just a second. Our argument was that, yes, but the way things like mental objects, and that doesn't mean imaginary chimeras or anything like that, but things like law, games, these kinds of various things, God operates kind of more like that. They're not simply things that they're defined by a system of kind of rules, and can't be empirically investigated like water, Clark Kent, and all these different things. And so the way that establishes and fixes on a reference is going to be very different. They didn't get it. And so you present a different argument, and I'm like, I really like them. Like, I don't know how they're going to get out of that. And so we're going to dive into that real quick. And let's define serious essentialism.
Okay, so serious essentialism is a metaphysical position that's defended by neo-Aristotelians. So Essentialism is a view that comes from Aristotle. It's the idea that things have essences. But then, sort of in the late 20th century, you had a very influential metaphysician called Kit Fine, who was trying to deal with a way of conceiving of modality. So modality, just for your audience, is just the way we understand about possibility and necessity and also contingency. So, for example, it's possible that I could be a doctor. It's possible that I could be a lawyer. It's possible that I could be an adult or a child. So these are possibilities, and necessities to do with things that must be the case. Now, what Kit Fine was doing in that he was trying to show through counterexamples, and again, as he was saying at the beginning about intuition, he was trying to show how we need to have an understanding of modality that takes into account the essences of things. So in order for me to understand what is possible, I need to understand, well, what is actually the essence of something? Now, the essence of something is just what it is to be that thing. So if I was to write out a definition of that thing, that would be the essence of it. So for example, if you go with the Aristotelian definition of a human is a rational animal. And so that would be expressing the essence of that thing. And so you have an essence, which is just what it is to be that thing. And you have something called a real definition, which is just the definition of that thing. So if I want to say, what is the essence of something? I give its definition. So what is the essence of a human? Well, it's a rational animal. Okay. And so the things that make up the essence of something are certain essential attributes. So in order for that being to be what it is, it must have these attributes. So if you go with a human again, in order for a human to be a human, it must have rationality. In order for a human to be a human, it must have animality. It must be an animal. So the idea here is that these are essential attributes that make up what it is to be that thing. So serious essentialism is just a view that was defended by neo-Aristotelians, Kit Fine, E.J. Lowe, and a few others, who are defending the idea that we need to take into account the essences of things when we are understanding. Yeah, so David Otterberg as well. Yeah, very good. Yeah, very, very good. David Otterberg, great book. So yeah, so you have these sort of individuals who are defending the idea that we have essences. So yeah, so it's a very reputable idea in metaphysics, and it's something which is defended by very prominent philosophers. And it's just the key idea that we need to rediscover the essences of things. In order for me to understand what something is, I need to be able to define it through a real definition. And that's sort of how I sort of unpack it at the beginning of the article. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I always tell my students when speaking about essences,
Yeah.
Which comes from ousia, right? What it is
Yeah.
to be, right? Toon.
Yeah.
The thing you can't take away without actually changing the subject and
Yeah.
fixing
Yeah.
a reference on something else.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's what it is to be the thing.
Yes.
Now,
Yeah.
what is really great is now that we have this set up of kind of a definition for real essentialism, why that's important is just like I said, if in our and trying to pick out an essence what something is by using the real kind of definition, if we find that something's essentially different, then we're talking about something different, isn't that?
Yeah.
So now you move into which is a great actually move. I never even thought about doing this. Although I knew it, right? Like again, we define God, the one God, to refer primarily to the Father. So this is not to say that the Son and the Holy Spirit are less God. This is what's known as the monarchia of the Father. Mm-hmm. And that, we have this in Saint Gregory the Theologian, the Cappadocians, Basil and Gregory Nyssa, as well as you point out in the creeds. Yeah. I believe in one God, the Father.
Yeah.
And then it's the Father by which who gives fully, right, the essence of the divinity, the nature to the Son and the Holy Spirit. Now, that might not seem important. I think for the most part, we were trying to focus people were trying to focus on triadology as distinguishing between the sort of kind of strict monotheism that the Muslim views. What's nice about what you presented is it's actually the monarchia. This is the essential feature.
Yeah.
And so let's talk a little bit about that. Because then it's from there that, again, to be father is to be father essentially over eternally a son and the Holy Spirit. And then that's when we can say they're the contradictory essential features of the conception of God.
Yeah, very true. So that's exactly it. So the focus here is on defining what it means to be God. Now, obviously, from an Orthodox perspective, which we're both coming from, I'm not saying I'm defining the essence of God. You cannot do that. That's unknowable. But what God has revealed himself through the scriptures and through Holy Tradition is the relationship in which he bears essentially to the Son. And so what we can understand from his revelation is that God is essentially the Father. And this was what the main contested point really in the 4th century. Is the Father contingently a Father, or is he essentially in the sense that do we have the Son existing as a creation of the Father? So he wasn't always there, as Arius and Eunomius in the latter part were arguing. Or do we have the Son existing co-relatively with the Father, such that he exists eternally with him, and the Father eternally generates him and also communicates all of his divinity eternally to the Son? And so the idea here is that was really the heart of the debate, even though sometimes it's stated differently. And so what I was saying is, well, when we are giving a real definition, what it is to be God within a Christian standpoint, according to Scripture, the Holy Tradition, which includes the creeds and the fathers, it is quite clear that in the first sentence of the Nicene Creed, there is a definition of God. We believe in one God, and then the qualification is the Father. It doesn't even say one God, the Trinity, it doesn't say anything else. It says one God, the Father. So the idea here is that to be God is to be the Father. But then also, to be the Father is not to be a Unitarian type of entity that exists alone, because then it wouldn't be the Father. To be the Father is to be the generator of something else. And so the idea here is that the Father is the Father because he eternally generates the Son. And so that is an essential attribute, feature, property, if you're using that type of language, of God, that he is the eternal generator of the Son. And so if he didn't eternally generate the Son, then he wouldn't be the Father, he wouldn't be God. And so the idea here is that when we're defining, again, what it is to be God, it is not just including his divinity, that God is all powerful, all knowing, and all loving, as we generally do, but it's also, especially from a Christian standpoint, to say he is the Father of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And so that is the defining feature of God within Christianity. But then within Islam, we see something different. There is a very clear teaching within the Islamic scriptures, the Quran specifically, that it says that Allah does not beget, neither is he begotten. A very clear statement there, that he does not beget, neither is he begotten. Now, Christians can all agree, yes, God, the Father, is not begotten. That's something we can agree with. But we cannot agree with the first part of that statement, that he does not beget, because that is going clearly against the authoritative teaching of Scripture and Holy Tradition, which includes the teaching of the Fathers and the teaching of the councils, and then also liturgically as well. So what we have here is Islam defines God in a different way. It defines God to be essentially I use the term that he's absolutely undifferentiated. What that means that he doesn't bear an eternal relation to anything. So he is a being that's alone. But we don't have that in the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview is that God the Father has always had the Son with him and also the Spirit. And so on the one hand, Allah, his essence is to be the absolutely undifferentiated being, bears no relation to anything eternally. But then to be God within Christianity is to be the Father, to be the eternal generator of the Son. And so we can say there is actually contradictions here, because on the one hand, if we define absolute undifferentiatedness to be bearing an eternal relation to something, then we can say Allah does not bear eternal relation to anything because he's absolutely undifferentiated. But then the Father does bear something eternal relation to something. So there is a clear contradiction here between these two concepts of God.
I'm going to jump forward real quick.
Yeah. Yeah.
You anticipated later on the objections to this.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think when our opponents say, well, you could have radically different conceptions, I should have in the debate asked them, can you have contradictory essential properties? Now, I did kind of bring this up because one of the things in Dr. Richard Swinburne's work, when defining the rational core, one of the, I think it's his seventh point, that this being demands worship. So it's not just omnipotent. And so I did kind of go somewhere similar with this, as like, well, what does it mean to be worship? Right? Worship means allegiance, right? It has the connotation of allegiance, right?
Yeah.
And so this is the one thing that I even thought in his, that you have contradictory properties through the notion of worship. If Islam demands worship, well, so does Christianity, but we have a different. It'd be like, here's my analogy. That would be like saying that, well, I could give allegiance to two different opposing armies. And so even that itself kind of gets to, well, hey, Richard, if that's an essential property, they're contradictory. I didn't think about it at the level that you did, and this is really good. But let's think about an objection where somebody might say, well, no, you could have a contradictory notion of something essential and yet still referring to the same thing.
Okay.
I'm trying to think. So could somebody assume that my wife was when we're talking about her name's her Orthodox name, Catherine, Matushka Catherine, essential feature is she's a three-sided geometrical figure. For whatever reason, somebody thinks that name refers to, or that she has some property. I could see them arguing this, that, whoa, I met your wife one time and they just get so confused over mathematics and human beings that for some reason they think one of her essential features is that the sum of angles equals 180 degrees. But we're still talking about the same thing. So I'm just thinking off cuff, right? That somebody might say something like that. So how would we respond? Now, of course, they think the reference fixed, and you talk about this later, through an actual historical event in which they're causally, through causation, looking at my wife, and then they go off the rails and start mixing math definitions with my wife. And say, but aren't we still talking about, we could be radically different and contradictory, but we're still talking about the same entity.
So I don't want to jump ahead, but do you want me to unpack about sort of the theory of reference that I sort of go with?
Forgive me. Let's put that on the back burner. Know that that's coming, and go ahead.
Okay, so that's a very important point, because what people might say is sometimes we have mistaken understandings of things, but we still refer to those things. So, for example, just going with that sort of famous, the Clark Kent and Superman one, Lois Lane, I don't think in the newest one, I think she does know he's Superman, but in the older ones, she didn't know he was Superman for a certain period of time. And so she would speak about Clark Kent, she'll speak about Superman, but have radically different understandings, different descriptions of those persons. Superman is an alien, Clark Kent is not an alien. Now, that can't be the case, because essentially Superman is an alien and Clark Kent is an alien. But then we would say that, well, she does seem to be picking out the same person when she refers to Clark Kent and she's referring to Superman, even though her understanding of Superman and Clark Kent are radically opposed. So then the objection here is that even though we have radically different understandings, even of essential properties, it seems to be that if we're mistaken about things, we can still pick out that thing that we're referring to, that we still have the reference in frame. Now, this is sort of piggybacking upon a very influential theory of reference that was put forward by Saul Kripke. Now, Saul Kripke was, as I said, a very influential philosopher. And his main contribution here was to put forward this sort of causal theory of reference. And there's different terms that people use for this, because he was trying to fight back something that's called, and sorry, not to get too much in the weeds for your audience, but there was something called the descriptivist theory of reference, which was defended by Frege and Bertrand Russell in the early part of the 20th century. And this was basically the idea that when we use a name, the name is synonymous with a description. So the example, for example, to go with is Aristotle. So Aristotle was, as we know in his life, he was a student of Plato. He was also the teacher of Alexander the Great. And so to be Aristotle, or to use the name Aristotle, what we're really saying is just the person who is a student of Plato, or the person who is a student, or sorry, he's a teacher of Alexander the Great. And so what you have here is a name is associated with a description. But then what Kripke was trying to say and push back on is that that just doesn't seem to be the way that we use names, because a lot of the time people can be radically, they can radically misunderstand the description of something, but still pick out that thing that they're talking about when they refer to it. So, for example, if someone just strangely, for some reason, believed that Aristotle was the person who discovered gravity, it still seems like we will be, let's say he believes he's a philosopher, believes that he was, he's very influential in metaphysics and all those sort of things that it's true of Aristotle. But then he also had this weird idea that Aristotle was the discoverer of gravity instead of Newton. We would still say that even though he seems to be mistaken in this point, he's still talking about the same person. But now that's a contingent property. But let's say that if he said that, let's say we had an essential property that we picked out of Aristotle. Let's say you believe something called origin essentialism, which is the idea that your origination is essential to you. So I am the son of my father, and that's an essential relationship that I have. I couldn't be Josh without having the father that I have. If I had another father, I'll be a different person. So anyways, let's say that someone has a misunderstanding of who Aristotle's parents were, and they believe it's someone else instead of these people who are truly Aristotle's parents. Would that mean that they're not really speaking about Aristotle, even though they have a misunderstanding of his essential properties? So Kripke was pushing back on this to say, no, the way in which names work is very simple. What happens is, firstly, something called a baptismal event, where not baptism in the theological sense, but similar in a way that a baptismal event, when it comes to reference, is where we sort of, for the first time, give a name to an object. So if we call a person David, we're now baptizing with that name, and that name now sticks to that person to refer to him. And then the way in which reference just sort of operates is through a causal link. I call my son David. Now, people that start referring to him as David, I start telling people he's called David, and his friends start calling him David when he gets older, and all these sort of things. And then he tells his kids he's called David. So all of this time, there's a causal link between the baptismal event, me calling him David from the beginning of his birth, and then him later on speaking about himself as David. So long as there is a link between the baptismal event, when we name the person, and our usage of that term, even if we're radically misunderstanding who that person is, we are still referring to that being. So what people do then, just bring this to a theological point, is that people say that even though we might have an incorrect understanding of what it is to be God, if we're a Muslim, coming from a Christian point of view, because they fall under the Abrahamic religions, there is a causal link with the first baptismal event that came when we started referring to God as God. And so because they are linked to the Abrahamic, let's say the Abrahamic event that was at the beginning, there is a causal link between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, such that when we're speaking about God, that term God, because we are linked together to that first event when we refer to God, even if we have misunderstandings of who God is, we still are referring to the same being because of that causal link. Do you want me to pause there before I go on to the Gareth Evans part, which is quite important, or do you want me to?
That's great. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So then, in light of this, there was a very influential philosopher who unfortunately didn't, who died quite young, but there was a very influential philosopher at the time called Gareth Evans, who he picked out a problem that he noticed with Kripke's idea. And basically, he was saying, well, okay, yes, I agree with you, Kripke. We need to throw descriptivism to the side, in the bin, because it just doesn't work. Names are more than descriptions. They don't need to have a description to pick out something. But then he was saying, but there seems to be a problem with the theory that Kripke is putting forward, because there are examples within reality in which names change their referent, where it was referring to one person or one object, and then over time, through whatever means, it then now starts referring to another object. How do we make sense of that? Because within Kripke's idea, that should never happen. Because even if I have a radically different idea, so one community calls David and they believe that he's, sorry, I don't want to get controversial, say that he's a woman, and then the other one believes he's a man. Are we picking out the same person? Okay. So the idea here is that there seems to be that reference can change, but how do we account for that change within the pure Kripkean theory? It doesn't seem like it's possible. So then what Evans says is that we need to think about the social function of names, because names are things which are embedded within a social context. And what he means by that is there isn't just a need for the baptismal event of a name. So I give David to my son, okay? And let me use a real example. I don't have sons, so Alison, my eldest. So I give Alison the name Alison. And that's from that point on, she's called Alison and people refer to her as Alison. And then people are picking out my daughter when they use the term Alison, if they are linked to that causal link, such that someone like myself tells my friend, yes, my daughter's called Alison, and they start referring to her as Alison. There's that causal link. But then Gareth Evans says we need to also have something else in order to track when reference changes or splits. And the way we do that is through something that he calls the dominant source of information. So if we can think about it, let's say we have a community, just so the audience understands, hopefully better. You have a community of people, and let's say they have like a treasure chest of their information about every person that lives on that island. Now, in order for us to know when we're referring to someone, we don't just need to be able to call that person and someone tell me that that person is called Alison or Josh or David. But we also need to have a certain description that we all agree upon that picks up that specific individual. So Alison, for example, is the daughter of Joshua. She is 8 years old and she is, X, Y, and Z. There are certain things that make Alison what she is. That is her essential attributes. So the essential attributes are what are part of what he calls the dominant source of information. So you can think about it like a file. We have a file on this object. And so when we are using a name, we also need to make sure that we can track that we're talking about the same thing by that file, the information in that file being true of that thing. Now, I'll give you an example. Examples are always helpful in philosophy to help become less abstract. So this is actually a real example. So Marco Polo, the famous explorer, he did something interesting with the word or the name Madagascar.
Yes.
So Madagascar used to pick out a city in mainland Africa. And so people in that area living in Africa would be referring to Madagascar as a city within the mainland. But then for some reason, when he was traveling, he got mistaken. I don't know how he did, but he got mistaken to believe that actually Madagascar, the name Madagascar, was picking out an island off the mainland of Africa. So instead of referring to a city in mainland Africa, Madagascar was now referring to this island. And so because Marco Polo's writing, so specifically within Europe, was very influential, when people started exploring Africa, they started referring not to Madagascar as a city in mainland Africa, but as the island. So let's say we have now two communities. We have the African community and we have the European community. Now, even though they're using the same word Madagascar, they actually have two referents now. They're not picking up the same thing. But why that's the case is because there was a split now in the usage of the word Madagascar. And why that happened is because of the information for Madagascar changed for the different community. So for the African community, Madagascar will have within its information set a city in mainland Africa. But in the information set for the community of the Europeans, it would have an island off mainland Africa. And so what is happening here is that even though before Madagascar used to pick out one thing, now when Europeans are using the word Madagascar, it's picking out something different from when Africans are using the word Madagascar. But then over time, really, when it became so widely spread that Madagascar picked out that island, the usage of the one within of the city in mainland Africa sort of fell off. But let me use a really, I think, helpful example that actually brings us home for probably a lot of people. Now, as your Orthodox audience, they will know, Santa Claus is a real person. Now, someone might be thinking, well, what are you talking about? I've never seen a guy flying around giving me presents on Christmas Day. But Santa Claus, when it was sort of the term which came to America was Sinterklaas, if I say that correctly, Sinterklaas or Sinterklaas. So it was a Dutch term which picked out, as we know, Saint Nicholas. It was a way in which they used the term Saint Nicholas, who was a real person, very influential in the 4th century and things like that, and very humble man. And he used to give presents to people, and so that's sort of the idea that you had there. So there was a real person called Sinterklaas. But then when the Dutch went to America, the Americans couldn't pronounce Sinterklaas very well, and they sort of anglicized it into Santa Claus. But then they were still referring to the same thing at that time. They were just using a translation of the term. So if someone at the time when the Dutch came, they were saying Santa Claus, yeah, Santa Claus is this bishop in the 4th century. The Dutch believed that and the Americans believed that. But then over time, what happened is that there was a split now in the term, the meaning of the term Sinterklaas. And how that happened was we now had two communities, the European community and the American community. Because of advertisements, Coca-Cola played a very big role in this, because of certain poems, this idea of Sinterklaas now became a fictional figure, this person who flies around on Christmas Day. But Sinterklaas, that same term, when it's used in Europe in certain places, it's picking out Saint Nicholas. And so what happened over time is because the dominant source of information, the file for Sinterklaas for both communities changed. One of them was picking out a bishop and the other changed, was rewritten and was now picking out a fictional character. When we use the term, we're using the term differently to pick out a different person. So when I use the anglicized version, Santa Claus, I'm referring to that flying person in the sky. But when in a different community I'm using the word Santa Claus, they'll say, oh yeah, that bishop. And they will not be referring to that person flying up in the sky. But what we need to understand here is that the word was picking out the same thing at the beginning. But then because the community had a change to their dominant source of information, there was a split in the reference with that specific term, such that Sinterklaas or Santa Claus was now referring to two different things because of the dominant source of information in the community being rewritten for one.
It reminds me of alchemy and chemistry being the same at one point.
Yeah, exactly. Like,
I'm not gonna go to the science building and be like, I'm looking for the alchemy department. Like they now mean, but they have their origin.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's sort of, so he was trying to ground it on actual real intuitive usage, because it doesn't seem to be the case that no matter what, reference is always going to be fixed. And it does seem to be that there is a break in reference. And sort of, sorry, I didn't speak about this here, but it is important. When reference breaks, when there's a denial of the essential attributes of something. But sort of putting it within the theory of reference, which I'm speaking about, what I mean by that is when the community sort of denies an essential attribute of something and changes it now from something to something else, what happens is there is a rewriting of the dominant source of information such that there is a split in reference. So with the Madagascar example, the essential attributes of Madagascar was being a city, okay, in a certain place. But then the community, the European community, they denied that, such that they were now saying, no, it's not a city. Of course it's not. If someone came to them and said a city, no, 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 it's an island. I know it's an island. And so the community, European community, was denying the essential attributes of this, and such that led within those different communities to a different reference being picked out. But something to notice here, within this idea, ignorance doesn't do that.
Yes.
So if I'm ignorant of something, that doesn't mean that I'm not referring to the same thing. And that's what the key thing with the sort of Clark Kent example is. The Clark Kent example is predicated upon ignorance. And so if it was that Lois Lane was presented with the truth of Superman and Clark Kent to her, and she said, no, no, I know Clark is not an alien, even though he's told me, even though I've seen him fly in the sky, even though all of this stuff, he's not an alien, it's all false. Then when she uses the word Clark Kent after that sort of event that has occurred of denial, she won't really be picking out that person anymore. But before that event of sort of disclosure and before the denial, because she was predicated upon ignorance, she was still not rewriting her own personal or the community's understanding of what Clark Kent was like. And so she was still attached to the community in its correct reference of Clark Kent. But when you deny something, you remove yourself from that community. And if it's large enough, the denial, the community might split such that one community is referring to one thing and another community is referring to another thing, even though they're using the same referent or reference term, sorry.
And that, what I really like about that too, it gets into the kind of philosophical and semantic meat of when people get confused about, they go back and be like, well, what about the, the early Jews and St. Paul, was he not because he was persecuting our Lord and stuff like that? These would all be examples.
Yeah.
It's an ignorance. You hadn't had a community, and you talk about this later, that obviously we make a distinction I always had between modern kind of contemporary rabbinical Judaism and first second temple Judaism. Like those are radically different precisely because of that, because then within terms of their rules, semantically and theologically, they actually specific denial. So there's no longer kind of couched behind just like, well, ignorance, or even if they rejected it, it wasn't a specific feature that it was defined within that community that separated to switch the reference.
Yes, yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Yeah. So that's true. So this sort of leads well into, sort of speaking about the theological application of this. So what then, taking into account sort of this general theory of reference and understanding of essences, what we can then understand and answer very clearly is that Christians and Muslims do not worship the same God. Why that's the case within this theory of reference is because at some point, specifically with the coming of Islam, there was a split within, let's call it the Abrahamic community. So let's say up until that point, you had the Abrahamic community that was including Jews, and I'm talking about Second Temple Jews, and then you had Christians, and they were part of the same community. Now, why that was the case, that they were able to be part of the same community, as I was saying to you before, as you were saying, is because let's say we have the dominant source of information about what it is to be God for the Jews. That was, God is the sole creator of everything. God is the ultimate, the foundation of all of reality. He is the father in a way of Israel, in that he elects Israel to be his people, and he sends them out to be a light to all nations. So these are all things which will be part of what it means to be God for the Jews. But there was never a clear denial of his internal relations, such that it was never revealed that God didn't have a son, or God had a son at that point in time prior to the coming of Christ. And so when then the Jews, specifically through the resurrection of Christ, and there was a sort of an illumination of who the person of Christ was, that the disciples went out preaching the message of Christianity, and then Paul was converted. What you had is that you had an updating of the dominant source of information for certain Jews, which they were called the followers of the way, and then later we call them the Christians. So certain Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, within their sort of small community inside the larger Judaic community, there was an updating of the information. But what happened was that updating of the information didn't split the community, because there was never something within that information set for what it means to be God that couldn't allow for that update to take place without
Yes.
there being a split. So now adding that God is the Father of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ eternally, and essentially, that wasn't something which was problematic at that time, in the sense that it wasn't something which went against what it meant to be God. If we went and denied and said, no, God is not the elector of Israel, he's the elector of another people group, that will be something which the Jews will say, no, that's not what it means to be God. God is the creator of all reality, and he has elected through Abraham and then his children, the people of Israel. But him saying that he is eternal, he's the eternal generator of the Son, and that specific point in time when it was happening, the preaching, there was no contradiction that was taking place. It was allowed to happen. And that's why I give this example of, or I highlight this point, that Paul was facing a lot of criticism for his views, but you never saw that he was having to fight off this idea that God is the Father. Like, you never see that debate coming up. You see that debate coming up in the 4th century.
Yeah.
But you never see that debate coming up. And we believe as Christians that Paul believed that and taught that Jesus is the eternal Son of the Father from the beginning. But that was never an issue. Yes, we had issues about circumcision. We had issues about the law. We had issues about the messiahship of Jesus and all those sort of things. But there was never an understanding that there's a problem with the God that they worship. They all believe that they worship the same God. But then later, no, actually, sorry, I'll get to that point later, about rabbinical. So yeah, so there was an inclusive community of Christians, and then non-Messianic Christians, those who didn't follow the person of Jesus, and that community. And then let's say we move then into the 6th century, we move into the time of Islam with Prophet Muhammad going around and preaching. So as people will know, the story, 570 he's born, and then 620 he goes around. 610 he starts preaching the message of Islam, and yeah, he converts, radically converts the sort of Arabian Peninsula at that time. And so the key thing though is what happens is when he provides the revelation of who God is, he adds something very important, as I said before. He recites something where God himself says, I do not beget, neither am I begotten. And so what he then does is that God, through the Prophet Muhammad, let's just say Muhammad and his followers, they now re-update the dominant source of information for the Abrahamic community. First, it was God is the elect of Israel. Then it was updated, God is the Father of Jesus Christ. And then it's updated here that God is not the Father of Jesus Christ. He's not, he doesn't beget anything. But then what we see happen then is, well, there seems to be a contradiction in the dominant source of information. And so what we have now is a split in the reference, given the split in the community. So now as the Christians and the Muslims were now split into different communities, the Christians are those who worship Christ and worship the Father through the Son and believe in his eternal generation. The Muslims are those who deny that. And so what happened was the Abrahamic community, as it actually socially split, it also split in a semantic level, in that the term God was no longer picking out the same being. Before the time of Muhammad, the Jews and the Christians were picking out the same being, even though the Christians might refer to him as the Father, and the Jews just refer to him as Yahweh or whatever, Jehovah, whatever term that they use. They would be picking out the same being. But when the Muslims start referring to God and they use the term Allah, that dominant source of information that allows us to track who they're talking about when they use the term Allah is now picking out a being who is all powerful, all knowing, but he is also some being that doesn't beget. So the same way that we see with Santa Claus, that term Santa Claus, where one community, the Americans and the Dutch, were using that term the same at the beginning, but then later on, over time, the two communities split, and also the reference splits, such that there are now two referents here. So we see the same thing with the Muslims now are referring to Allah, God, and Christians are referring to God, but they're not picking up the same thing because the dominant sources of information, which allows us to track what we're talking about, are not the same anymore.
Yeah, excellent. Very good. Everybody following that in the chat? Let's see.
Yeah, sorry, it's a lot. Hopefully I haven't sent them all to sleep. Hopefully it's still early there, so it's not too what happened.
But that's an excellent.
Mm,
I mean, that's the like I said, the nuts and bolts
mm,
that our opponents um, need. And what I like about what you just presented too, it's far more robust than what I had previously said. I mean, it's the same thought. It's just
yeah,
more meticulous.
just from a different angle, really.
When
Yeah,
I said that, when I would always say that the ancient Hebrews didn't have a strict uh, monotheism.
yeah, yeah,
So for some reason, people just lack nuances. I don't know.
yeah,
We have this idea that, well, the modern kind of rabbinical Jews, their conception and is, Muslims, that must be what the ancient Hebrews
yeah,
had too. But you see this, you pointed out, there wasn't a debate about God being the Father or anything like this. And we even see, when I teach catechesis too, okay, it's not a Nicene Creed kind of clarity, but the fact that there is these sorts of kind of distinctions in God, even in the ancient Hebrews, shows that that's not the same as the Islamic community and the modern kind of rabbinical Jewish, which, as
yeah,
you put, as far as getting into the nitty gritty on that, is because there's a specific denial,
yeah,
right? There was kind of an openness, right, and it wasn't exactly clear, right, because Revelation further reveals God. Um, but there was no debate. There was, in a sense, there's a sort of ignorance too, and it's an argument that I've always made too,
yeah,
that why children are obviously worshiping the Trinity, even though if you ask
yeah,
them about it, they wouldn't be able to articulate. There's something kind of analogous to that. I've
yeah,
always used that argument, but this is much better. This is like, again, the really kind of robust way of explaining like exactly why that's the case, and how those two reference
yeah.
how there's departure in terms of fixing the referent at that point.
Mm.
Very good.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Because I think, yeah, a lot of people they might buy into the idea, but then think the first light bulb moment or the question that comes into mind is, well, how do you make sense of Judaism? That seems to, as you were saying, have a denial of the eternal sonship of Christ and the eternal generation of him. And so, yeah, that's what I try and do, as you were saying, sort of make a distinction, but which we don't do a lot. But all scholars sort of working within Second Temple Judaism, they are very clear that monotheism doesn't mean what we mean by monotheism. It didn't mean the same thing for the Jews, and that term wasn't even existing.
Till
For
the late
example,
1600s
yes, yeah,
anymore.
it wasn't
Yeah.
existing. So I will point people. There's a very good paper by Paula Friedrichsen, a very influential ancient Jewish scholar, and she has I think I can actually get it up, the name. As soon as I had it somewhere. Yeah, so it is Philo, Herod, Paul, and the many gods of ancient Jewish monotheism, where she sort of gives an argument, just saying that was there within the Judaic mindset, deity was a plurality. There were many deities in their understanding, but there was only one God that they worship, Yahweh. But there were many gods that they understood within that within that sort of framework. And you have people like Larry Hurtado, very famous. He passed away a few years ago. Very famous again, scholar of ancient Judaism or Second Temple Judaism, and he has, very important works like the Lord Jesus Christ, and other books where he argues again that what distinguished the Jews at that time wasn't the belief in gods. They believed in many gods again, but there was only one God worthy of worship. There was only one God that they could sacrifice to. They wouldn't sacrifice to any other God, even though they might recognize that there were the other deities that might existed. So just so you have to understand that when Christianity was developing, it was developing within that contextual setting where there wasn't this sort of strict, we would call monotheism, where there can only be one deity and nothing else existing within the worldview. That's what monotheism. That's not what Judaism was like at that time. at the Second Temple and in the First Temple Judaism. And so that's why, again, that when Paul has things like saying, that Christ was, he was equal with God and didn't, in Philippians, and didn't count that and became a slave. And, he doesn't have to then put a footnote and say, oh, this is what I mean by equal with God. He is this, to try and make sense of it. No, he just moves on, because for them, that was not a problem to understand that type of thing at all. Or even in John, like, the beginning, the very famous, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Again, we don't need to have a massive explanation by John himself saying, this is what I mean by this when I'm talking about Jesus. Because again, it was something which wouldn't have really been counted. But what their issue is that, is Jesus related to the God of Israel or not? Or is he of something else? So what I then say is, well, when we get to Rabbinic Judaism, which is the Judaism after the fall of the temple in post 70 AD, so it's actually, Rabbinic Judaism is younger than Christianity, and so what you sort of have is that it becomes a more insulated understanding of Judaism, and Judaism now develops in a rabbinic sort of context in conversation with Christianity, because Christianity was then growing and developing. Rabbinic Judaism, which was smaller as it was growing, was in conversation. And what there was now was, if you're a Jew, you're not a Christian. If you're a Jew, you're not a follower of the Messiah. If you're a Jew, and then this is post 4th century, 5th century, you don't believe in the Trinity. And so how you sort of see this played out now in a contemporary context is, think about the way that Jews treat Messianic Jews.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting point that you...
Yeah.
And I didn't even know about the state of Israel actually had laws. They're like theological laws defining that.
Yeah, exactly. So you sort of see that they already, even in the contemporary context, there's a very clear demarcation between what it means to really be a Jew and what it means to be a Jew, let's say with quotation marks. And so what happens here is there is a clear denial of the eternal generation of the Son within Judaism as we understand it today. But that wasn't the case in the time of Paul. So what happens is, after the fall of the temple, and then as Rabbinic Judaism sort of develops, similar to Islam, there is that split in the community and a split in the referent, such that when Rabbinic Jews are using the term God, they're not picking out the same being that we are picking out when we use the term God, because of that denial. That denial changed their community file such that they mean different things when they're referring to God. But with the time of Paul, if a Jew was, speaking about God, but they didn't refer to him as the Father, that was in ignorance of the revelation that was provided. And so it wasn't a denial. They were still referring to the same thing until later on when you had that split. Yeah.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
In terms of an objection, it came up. I mean, if I wanted to be a good Aristotelian, in a way yes, in a way no, right? Like we always, well, yes, yes, way no. So when I was having this debate with Dr. Trent Dortry and Dr. Christopher Tomaszewski, there is. So when, let's say I'm having a conversation with a Muslim or a modern rabbinical Jew, and in some sense, we want to say, even if we're talking about Christ and we're having a disagreement about, or just God in general, that well, we're talking about in one way, the same thing, but at the same time, I wanted to maintain, but the reference changed. No, so this is a little bit different than Madagascar, because obviously, and maybe, I don't know, maybe you could argue this, but it seems like we're just talking about two different, one's an island and one's a city, so it's totally changed. Santa Claus versus St. Nicholas. But one thing that came to me, and I still got to flesh this out some more and think about it, was Tarski's distinction between object language and meta language. And so if I'm having a theological debate about who God is, in one sense, I want to say, well, we're understanding each other, what the argument's about. So we're referring to, at some level, the same, something that's the same. But at the same time, how do I say, but we're not? And so I thought, and I'll just get your thoughts on this too, it actually stumped them. They were like, is that, well, maybe it's something similar to like meta language. right? We're talking about the theology, like we understand what we're talking about.
Mhm.
However, in an object language, clearly it's the reference have changed. Do you think
Mhm.
that's helpful? Is that something that I should explore?
I think so, yeah, definitely. Because I think, yeah, the sort of the context, yeah, the context, it seems to be that we're talking about the same thing at a contextual level.
Yes.
But yeah, when we're sort of thinking about actually, well, is the object that we're talking about, is it really the same thing? Well, it cannot be because of the essential attributes it has and the denial of that by myself or by the community. But at a contextual level, it seems to be like um, we are talking about the same thing. So think about it like with an atheist and with a Christian. Um, God's existence is necessary to who he is. Majority of people outside of Swinburne will affirm that God is a necessary being, such that he must exist. But an atheist is denying that.
Mm-hmm.
So are they,
That's a great point.
yeah, at a contextual level, it seems like we are talking about the same thing. But then also the Christian will just say, well, whatever being you're talking about is just some fictional entity that you think is God, but it's not. So it's sort of the Anselmian idea here that the fool thinks there is no God. Because well, when we think about God, he essentially exists such that he could not exist. He
So
must
you're
exist.
contradicting yourself, yeah.
Yes, yeah, yeah. But in sort of the area of the discussion, it seems like we are talking about this. We're in the same discussion. Okay, it's not like I'm talking about, I'm talking about football. Sorry, I'm an American football fan, by the way.
Yeah.
So when I use football, I'm actually using your
Oh,
language.
okay.
Yeah, yeah, I'm
I don't have to
big fan.
translate.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So when I'm talking about football, I'm talking about this. But then when a British person is talking about football, they're talking about something else. So even though they're using that word, it seems like the context of the discussion is just different. They're not really there.
Yes.
But when we're talking about God, it seems like the context is the same, but it just seems like one is, for example, talking about a fictional entity and one is not. So maybe with let's say we're talking about a being who gives gifts. Okay, so the Santa Claus. It seems like we're talking about the same thing when we're talking. The context of discussion is, well, yeah, we're talking about the being that gives gifts, but the Santa Claus of Americans is a fictional being, doesn't exist. But the Santa Claus of the Dutch did exist. He was a being who existed and was giving gifts. But the context seems to be that we are in a sort of a meta way talking about the same thing. But when we're talking about the objects, because there is a denial of the essential attributes of one of them, could be existence, could be generation, could be whatever it is, it seems like we are actually picking out two different referents.
Now, the reason why I bring that up is because it was a clever objection. It took me
Yeah.
a while to kind of think about how to respond.
Yeah.
Um,
But I think
but
that's the way to go, the way you
yeah.
were thinking about it, yeah.
Um, so the argument from the opponent's side um, is, well, if we're not referring to the same thing, there's no disagreement. There is a disagreement. Um, Therefore, we have to be obviously talking about the same thing if we're legitimately going to have a disagreement. And the example was used. Uh, Suppose, I think Dr. Trenchard said, somebody sees his phone and he has a friend named Jesus,
Yeah.
which is spelled the way we would say Jesus,
Yeah.
and also then it says also Jesus wife,
Yeah.
right, um in the contacts.
Mhm.
And then somebody sees the phone, be like, wait a minute, Jesus doesn't have a wife. And it says, oh, well, there's no disagreement. But I don't disagree with you because we're talking about two different things. And I hadn't thought about that objection until, they had brought it up. And then I thought about, okay, that doesn't really work because, again, there's a way in which, again, you said contextually or to meta language, that we're having a legitimate disagreement, even though at fixing the level of fixing the reference at object language, clearly we're not referring for the following reasons.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, anyways, I just thought I'd
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you want to steel man the argument. I thought,
Yeah.
that's a clever objection. I hadn't heard it before.
Yes, yeah. No, but I would say, yeah, the disagreement thing is one of the main arguments they were putting forward, if I remember from the discussion you had. But yeah, I mean, just think with the Madagascar example again. So if I say, oh, I can drive from Nigeria to Madagascar, okay, one of the Africans says that, and everyone's like, yeah, of course, it probably takes, maybe 10 hours or whatever to get to that place. But then a European says, what do you mean you can drive? You need to take boat to get to Madagascar if you want to go to Nigeria. Now, sorry, if you want to get to Madagascar, sorry, if you want to get there from Nigeria. Now, what we would say in that scenario is they're just not talking about the same place.
Yeah.
Even though they're disagreeing, because they're disagreeing about the term, but they're just ultimately talking about the two communities, because they've diverged so much from each other in their usage of that word and their understanding of what it means to be Madagascar. They're just not referring to the same thing, but this disagreement can still be had. Disagreement is just had because we're just at the semantic level, it's the same word. Madagascar, Madagascar. Linguistically, it's the same word. But the thing that allows us to track when that word actually has a referent is diverging now from when it was like in the case. And that's because the information the Europeans have about Madagascar is that you can get there, but you have to get there by a boat. But the information that the Africans have is, no, you can get there, but you can get there by car. You don't need a boat. And it's because of that information is different. So disagreement, just because you can disagree about something, doesn't mean that there has to be, you're talking about the same.
You're fixing the same, yeah.
Exactly. Yes, yeah. It doesn't necessarily mean that, yeah.
I know we should maybe probably wrap it up. So I want to, let's see. What's the last part we should talk about? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's sort of, because I mean, why it was a hot topic is because it was brought in the context of Catholicism and Orthodoxy and sort of things. So maybe it's good just to see where sort of the cards fall for both sort of traditions. So from my understanding, and I've been some people have pushed back on this in saying that they can deny as a Catholic that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. I just don't see that to be the case, because it just seems to be, if you take Vatican II to be an ecumenical council and the documents of them to be authoritative, even infallible in a sense, because it's an ecumenical council, then you cannot deny what it literally says, that they do worship the same God. But then even within a Roman Catholic context, you don't even need to say it's infallible. I mean, there is just submission of the intellect.
I'm surprised how many Roman Catholics don't know that.
Yes, yeah.
I teach at a Roman Catholic college. I went to, my undergrad is like the most Roman Catholic college in the world, probably. And, I bring this up with Roman Catholic friends, and they were like, no, that's not true. And I'm like, yes, universal ordinary magisterium is binding. Yes. You can't.
Yes, exactly.
So it doesn't have the same kind of epistemic status as infallibility or something like that. But, so they just denied that.
Yeah. And that's really problematic. I mean, and play this out for them. Like, say, okay, if I was a Catholic professor and then I went out and, I said to my students in front of, the bishop or whatever, oh, yeah, you know what? You don't actually have to believe what this document, what Vatican II actually says. You don't have to hold to it. You can deny it, and you can be in right standing with the Pope. I will lose my job, because the understanding here is that you do not have authority to do that. Authority lies in the magisterium. And so when the magisterium declares something to be authoritative, even though it might not be infallible, it is binding in the sense that this is what the church teaches. You don't define what the church teaches. The church defines, according to the magisterium, what it teaches. And this is what it's declared to be the case. Catholicism, according to Vatican II, authoritatively teaches that Muslims and Christians worship the same God. You can deny it, but you will be falling in the Protestant camp of interpreting, for yourself, when actually, if you want to be a Catholic, you need to follow what's the authoritative teaching of the church. So Catholics, I know there's sort of been a way of trying to get out of it, but if I'm honest, you really can't. I mean, this is just at a sort of the ordinary level, and if you don't even affirm the infallibility of it, there is a submission of this as an authoritative teaching. But then what people will bring up is sort of the examples of certain patriarchs who have sort of spoken about this issue. And what I wanted to highlight was there's a different ecclesiology, as Orthodox will know, and Catholics as well, who understand the debate. There's a wholly different ecclesiology between these two Christian traditions. Even though there is bishops, there are presbyters, there are priests, there are deacons. You have that sort of threefold ministry, the holy orders. You have the sharing of sacraments as such, when it comes to what sacraments are and the mysteries are. But the way that actually authority lies within Orthodoxy and Catholicism is very different. It never resides in one individual. It is always
Kataholos, yeah.
yes, it is a conciliar
Conciliar.
authoritative framework. And so what we need to understand is even if someone so authoritative in Orthodoxy as the ecumenical patriarch says something which seems to indicate that, oh yeah, Christians and Muslims worship the same God, that is not at all binding on Orthodoxy. That's not expressing the teaching of Orthodoxy. The things that express the teaching of Orthodoxy is simply that of holy tradition. So what is within holy tradition? Scripture, the councils, the consensus of the fathers, liturgy, the liturgical, the liturgy of the church, and various other means that make up what holy tradition is. That is what expresses the position of Orthodoxy. And so even if you have the first among equals as such, with the Patriarch of Constantinople saying certain things, that is not at all expressing it. It's different from when the Bishop of Rome says something within Catholicism. When he does state something, that is the position of Catholicism, even if you like it or not. That is what Catholicism teaches. When Orthodoxy, you have a similar authoritative level of a person. No, it's not, because that's not the way that doctrine is ever defined. It's defined at the conciliar level, the consensus of the bishops together in guided by the Spirit. And so, yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that. So what we have then, when we look at the authoritative texts, is we have it very clearly, as I was saying to you before, that the Father, that God is the Father. He is he is the eternal generator of the Son. That is what it means to be God. And given what we then understand, what Muslims are teaching, what it means to be God, they do not worship the same being. So what we are bound to believe as Orthodox is that God is the Father, and he eternally generates a Son. He's essentially the Father. And so Muslims cannot worship the same God if they deny that to be the case. But then where Catholics are sort of caught in a bind is that they want to sort of say Muslims and Christians, they are, they have different understandings of God, but they're referring to the same thing. But as we've seen the argument play out, that's just not the way it goes at all.
Yeah. And I make this point all the time. People say, oh, you're not obeying your bishop. You're going against your bishop. First of all, it's not my bishop.
Yeah.
And they have a hard time because there's one bishop. I mean, there's many, but under one, and the papacy. And so they have, like you said, a total different ecclesiology.
Yeah.
But as far as defining dogma in a binding sense, no bishop can do that.
Yes.
And it reminds me just of the kind of ancient and antiquity, the notion of the king. The king does not create law; he represents it. He can declare it, but he's kind of an image of the hierarchy of nature.
Yeah.
And they believed in kind of objective laws in nature that represents God. So he's a king in as much as he represents the divine created order and legal system. He doesn't by fiat just declare, and I say this. And our bishops are like that too.
Yeah.
They don't create, they don't have the power to create and define dogma.
Yes. Yeah.
It is it's the kataholos, which is the whole, and the conciliar model. What they are given is a prerogative of authority. They certainly are, but that's primarily administrative.
Yes, very much.
Right. So they can say a theologumena, a theological opinion. You're not going against your bishop because, first of all, it's not administrative.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do, and that's what the bishop's prerogative is. But as far as defining doctrine in a binding way, that's synods and councils. Like
yes, exactly.
the whole.
Yeah.
And so I just struggle sometimes. I'm like, are they not understanding, or they don't want to understand it, or a little bit of
Yeah,
both,
because
or like,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And why I try to bring up this, I think I bring up the example of think about in the first millennium. If that was the case, that when the bishop of when the patriarch of Constantinople speaks, it's binding,
Mhm.
then what happens in the case of Nestorius?
Mhm.
Because was it then binding that that his view of the nature of Christ and the relationship to the blessed Theotokos, was that the correct understanding of orthodoxy? Well, the church didn't see it like that. They were very happy to condemn him. But if you think of the Catholic model, no council, no one can condemn the Pope in that
Mhm.
sense, in the modern day understanding. So when the Pope speaks, all must submit within Catholicism. Doesn't matter who the bishop or cardinal is, they must submit when the Pope speaks. But if that was the case within Orthodoxy, then it should have been the same thing when the patriarch spoke from Constantinople with Nestorius. Everyone should submit to his understanding. No, it was debated and brought to the council, and the council declared infallibly that his teaching was heretical, and that actually Christ is a single person of later two natures, and the Blessed Virgin Mary is the Theotokos, and so this is the same idea just played out, because with Orthodoxy, as something which has been so important in me becoming Orthodox, was the importance of preserving the teaching of the church throughout the millenniums. And so the same way that the church behaved towards patriarchs in the first millennium is the exact same way that the church behaves in the Orthodox Church to patriarchs in the second millennium. So there is no sort of distinction between that. So the same way that if the patriarch started saying something that was incorrect, he would be under the corporate examination of the bishops, because at the end of the day, the bishops are all equal. There is no sort of hierarchy of bishops as you would
Yes.
have with Catholicism. But the Catholics, they don't have that option at all. If the Pope decides to speak and say, as it was voiced in Vatican II, that Christians and Muslims worship the same God, that is what the teaching of the church is, rain or shine, really.
Yeah, that was a great point.
Yeah.
Well, let me see if there's that's a great point to end on. And so everybody convert to Eastern Orthodoxy,
Yes,
and
yeah, yeah,
may be blessed.
yeah.
I want to give a shout out to Justin Henley. Tips $20. I don't see any questions. Huh.
Hopefully that's because people are still awake, or they haven't slept off and they just understood everything.
Yeah, that's exact. Yeah, I hope so
Yes, yeah,
too.
yeah.
Anyways, Joshua, thank you so much for this.
No,
Is
thank you.
great paper, and may God continue to bless your work and your teaching,
Mhm,
and you know, and that sense your ministry.
mhm,
And yeah, I've been waiting a long time
mhm.
to have you on, and
Yeah,
everybody was thrilled with
yeah,
the announcement to have you
yeah.
on. So God bless you and your
Thank you.
family,
Thank you so much. Thank
and
you. I really appreciate that. And
yeah,
could I just give just if people are interested in just a further work, which
yes,
sort of I wouldn't. It's not really related to this, but it's just for those who might be inquirers about orthodoxy and the truth of orthodoxy. So, 5 months ago, I was received into the Orthodox Church, and that was over a very long period of time of really reflecting on, why, what was the church like in the first millennium, and which body of Christianity actually preserves the teaching and the structure, ecclesiological structure, of the church in the first millennium. And so this, over time, just led me very clearly to the Orthodox Church. And so many people were asking me, well, what was the reason why I converted? And so I spent quite a bit of time writing an article, which sort of turned into, it's book size now, and it's uploaded to my academia page. If anyone just types my name in, Joshua
I'm gonna
Sijuwade.
put it in right
Yes,
now,
yes,
so
yeah.
everybody has it in the
And
chat.
yeah, so the article's called The Identity of the Church, a comprehensive argument for the truth of Eastern Orthodoxy. And so where I really, it's quite a long, very long for an article. It sort of turns into a book, and it will be published later, about 90 pages, where I, at a philosophical level, historical level, and theological level, give a very robust argument for why Eastern Orthodoxy is the truth, and why we should why we should take it to be the truth over that of Protestantism and also Roman Catholicism. So if people are interested in sort of seeing another sort of another argument as such to prefer orthodoxy, then hopefully they'll look up that article
So
and
I
have fun.
linked the academia.edu, and now I'm going to link
Yes.
the actual article from the academia.edu. I mean,
Yeah.
just to make it easier.
Yes.
And
Yeah, that'll be perfect.
anything else you want to leave our audience with?
Yeah, no, that's fine. So yeah, I'm always open for discussions. If anyone has any questions, they can, normally people message me on Facebook, or they'll message me on some social media, or academia. You can always reach me through there. But I'm always happy to speak to anyone, and I'll always try and respond to anyone that sends me a message. So yeah, just thank you again for having me on. It's blessed. You have a great intellect, so I'm really happy that I was able to have this discussion with you, Deacon. So thank you very much for this. I really do appreciate this.
Again, God bless, and keep up the
you.
great work, and my prayers to you. And we'll have you back on. We'll come up with
Yes.
another topic to come
That'd be
up
great.
with.
That'd be
Yeah,
great.
okay.
Thank you so much, Deacon. All right, then. Take care. Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, good job. Awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Deacon.